so you have this problem where when the intense propaganda builds up, whether it's about Saddam Hussein in 2002 and 2003, or whether it's about Gaddafi in 2011, or Assad, or Putin, or Yanukovych in Ukraine, in the midst of those propaganda barrages, which are now extremely sophisticated, because what we've had is the U.S. government, through the National Endowment for Democracy, through the U.S. Agency for International Development, other State Department operations, through groups like some of the Soros operations, who sort of feeds another sort of neoliberal kind of approach. You have all these different groups that seem to be, on the surface, they seem to be kind of independent, but if you dig down enough, they're being funded by many of these other entities belonging in some ways to the U.S. government. So what they're really doing is they're promoting what they consider helpful to U.S. foreign policy, and that is often to demonize some of these foreign leaders. And this is not to say that some of these foreign leaders are good guys. I'm not saying that at all. But they're turned into Hitler. I mean, it's always this effort to make them into Hitler. And what that does by demonizing these foreign leaders, you cannot have a rational discussion about what is a smart or a legal or whatever decent policy in that topic, because whenever you sort of show there's nuance here, or there's another side to something, you're immediately called a stooge of, you're a Moscow stooge, or you're a, so you end up with this sort of, so then you get demonized. So the smart play for politicians as well as journalists now is to either finesse that, not go there, which is what you sort of were saying Sanders was doing, or go along with it, go with the flow, because then you're seen as a good guy, you're patriotic, you can maybe get that big promotion you're hoping for. And so so if you're especially if you're, this is even more for TV, because that's even more personal, because you're up there with your face on it. But it also applies to print. It also applies to the print publications. The New York Times will not, essentially, if you want to sort of say, gee, there's really more sides to this situation with Russia than we're presenting, they actually do have some legitimate concerns and arguments. They do understandably feel hemmed in by NATO. They do feel that we helped overthrow the elected government of Ukraine. There was a coup, where the New York Times has insisted there was no coup in Ukraine, by the way. And the way they did that was to ignore all the evidence of a coup, including the intercepted phone call in which the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, is discussing with the U.S. ambassador in Kiev who to put in charge of the government after it changes. Now, if you ignore evidence like that, the evidence of a coup, I guess you can reach a conclusion like they did, that there was no coup. But so you end up with this. But if you want to move up in the New York Times, you're going to have to play ball, and so very few people are going to go against that. So that's the kind of reality I see. It's not even a direct order in many cases. It's not like some people getting together to meet, but it's that if you're a working journalist in these places, you know what your boss wants.
Go along together.
When I was at Newsweek, I knew exactly what Maynard Parker, the executive editor, wanted. I wouldn't give it to him, and and he hated me for it. He really came to the point of hating me for it. But I wasn't going to bend and start reporting falsely, or allow that pressure to alter how I would report. But that doesn't help your career. It didn't help my career. And that we're talking about large sums of money that people can lose by not going along, and large sums you can make by going along. A lot of my former colleagues at Newsweek are now pundits on TV shows, and they make money hand over fist. They have nice vacation homes. They sent their kids to the best prep schools and all the rest of it. They're real deal here.
Would you use the word hypocrite
about what?
About certain people that you're mentioning in the media that go along to get along? Would you use that word possibly? Hypocrite.
Well, I suppose if they're pretending to be one thing and then doing something else, but I would say more in most of these cases they're opportunists. They see
an opportunist can be a hypocrite. A hypocrite can be an opportunist. Yeah, I mean.
Right, but I see it. In some of these cases, I mean, sometimes perhaps if they're pontificating about the purity of journalism and they're acting this way, I would say, yeah, that's hypocritical. But in many cases, I think it's even less than that. They just saw an opportunity to advance themselves, and they saw the risks of going the other way, and and they made the smart choice for themselves on a personal income level.
Personal income level. If every I believe in every hotel room in the country and in every high school, they instead of having the Bible only or the New Testament, whatever you call it, they should have Orwell's 1984. Everybody should read that book. And if people would understand what he was saying in 1984, just the one thing. If you remember, the country that Oceania was fighting against, it was Eurasia, I think it was called. They were having this war with Eurasia. But it wasn't against Eurasia, it was against the leader, Goldstein. So they made Goldstein was Eurasia. And it's amazing, but that's what we've been doing for so long in this country. It's like you said, it's not Iraq, it was Hussein. It wasn't Libya, it was Gaddafi. And they do that now it's Assad with Syria. They always make the country into the one guy, that leads it. And
it's much easier to demonize one person. And we saw it, of course, in the 80s with, say, Danny Ortega in Nicaragua, who was, I'm not saying he was a great guy either, but he was certainly not the monster they made him out to be. The Sandinistas weren't some powerful totalitarian force. What did Reagan call it, a totalitarian dungeon? I mean, they couldn't get anything straight in Nicaragua when I'd visit. It was like you were almost like thinking that Negril in Jamaica would be a totalitarian dungeon. It was just kind of it was almost like it was a Caribbean style country, with very poor and not very efficient. But Reagan we started seeing this really aggressively under Reagan, and it's continued under the presidents of different parties. This use of intense propaganda and the use of these various entities, like the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created in 1983, remember, and the same person, Carl Gershman, who was a neocon, remains the head of it to this day. And he basically is a paymaster. He has $100 million of taxpayer money every year to sort of pay out to different activists, journalists, NGO groups, and their job is to then do what gets them the next grant. So they're going to be doing what they think the U.S. government wants. And if the U.S. government wants a country destabilized, if they want to we brought a lot of people into the square to protest this government position or something, that's what they're looking for. If it's a U.S. favored government, well, then that's different. But if it's a government that the U.S. wants to manipulate or to get rid of, then these groups are sent out to do that, to cause trouble, destabilize, etc. It's kind of what the CIA used to do. In fact, William Casey, the CIA director, was instrumental in creating the National Endowment for Democracy. It was essentially moving some of the CIA's activities kind of above board, but not really that above board, but sort of setting it up in a somewhat different way, because the CIA by that point had been pretty discredited. So now you could just call it National Endowment for Democracy, which sounds better. So you had these different techniques that evolved out of the 80s and have now become just the way it's done. And it really is a case where the so-called soft power is often using propaganda or disinformation against your enemies. And in some cases, people like Secretary of State Clinton praised this, as she called it, smart power. And smart power was supposedly better than military power or hard power. But in many ways, they're kind of they often lead to the same thing. Soft power is often a way to set up for hard power, because by discrediting a leader of this country, by demonizing him, by creating some disorder, you can then say, well, we're just going in to help these freedom-loving people who are, so who we've sort of secretly funded, but now they're protesting, and we have to go in there. So you end up so often this idea of soft power is just the gateway to the use of hard power. We saw that was the case, and certainly the case in Libya in 2011, a country that's now still in total disarray. People are virtually starving in Libya because they can't get any money because the oil exports have been cut off because of there are several competing governments now, and no one can quite figure out who controls what. So they're not allowing any oil money to come in. So the people of Libya who had been living, sure, it wasn't the greatest system at all, but Gaddafi had provided through his government for a lot of social benefits. People had a pretty high standard of living. And the other thing that Gaddafi was trying to do, which is very significant to this, he was trying to give some of the former French colonies a currency, an African currency, so they wouldn't be dependent on the French currency.
That's right.
And so when the French president Sarkozy at the time got wind of this, that elevated the need to get rid of Gaddafi. And now don't worry, there'll be no, since now Libya is a basket case, there's not going to be any use of Libya's oil money to help free these African countries from dependency on the French franc. And that's how often things work. But as far as the American people were concerned, there was just all this propaganda about Gaddafi, and there are also stories that kind of get stuck into the people believing them, that they're really dubious or maybe even untrue. Like, for instance, the alleged Libyan role in the Lockerbie bombing.
Right.
The evidence is pretty clear that it was not the Libyans, that it was some other group, a terrorist group. But at the time that this was sort of presented, it became easier to blame the Libyans because, everyone hated the Libyans. So it kind of got, despite the very thin evidence and actually contradictory evidence and I think perjured evidence, it was stuck on, they finally arrested these two Libyans, right? One was Megrahi, and then there was another fellow. And the case was so weak against both of them, they let one of them go. This was a special tribunal set up with Scottish judges. They let one of them go, but because they didn't want everyone to be just let off, they decided to make Megrahi the fall guy and the scapegoat, and so they locked him up. Even though later on the Scottish authorities realized this was a miscarriage of justice, but the thinking still remained that Gaddafi was responsible for the Lockerbie bombing. So when Hillary Clinton would talk about this, she'd say he has American blood on his hands. She was talking about the Lockerbie bombing, but it's almost certainly he had nothing to do with it. We forced him to take responsibility for it because it was the only way to get sanctions removed from Libya, because the people there were being denied medicines and so forth. So we end up with these kind of propaganda themes where we pin something on somebody, and people after a while say, "Oh, just admit you did it," and if you didn't do it, just say so, but then it comes back as an argument for invading your country. So that's why
I think. Go ahead, Bob. Here's the thing, Rob.
Well, I think it's very important to get these facts straight, because, and this is the same case if you'd say now we're dealing with the issue of the MH17 case. Again, it's an extremely murky area but we've allowed this very biased investigation now to sort of determine the truth. But it certainly may not be the truth. It certainly, all you can say is it's an allegation at this point, and there are other ways to read the evidence. But because
Robert,
as long as you're demonizing people that are unpopular, people accept it, but then it becomes the basis for further action. It becomes the basis to escalate the tensions. And this is very dangerous stuff. And this is one of the reasons I'm concerned about right now, because we don't seem to care that much of the narrative about Ukraine particularly is either false or wildly distorted by the propaganda that's been fed into this on the American side. And because but the public is generally accepting this stuff, and certainly the press has bought into it entirely, almost across the board, that that you have now a set of conditions for a serious escalation into possible nuclear conflict.